in the preface and high up in the preface, I talk about the fact that Superman was such a combination of self-assured and innocent that he could wear his underwear on the outside, and we no longer think that's funny. And I mean, if I were coming in from outer space and I saw a character who was dressed like this, my first question would be, did he forget when he was putting on his clothes the order that you put them on? But nobody asks it anymore. That is part of the iconic Superman and who he's become. So Jerry never explained that in his memoir or anywhere else. And maybe it was Joe Shuster. Joe Shuster, his artist buddy, said the way he knew what Superman looked like was he would stand in front of a mirror and draw what he saw. Joe Shuster didn't look anything like Superman, but everybody saw themselves as Superman. So I gave a talk a couple nights ago, actually it was a week ago or so, at the Boston Public Library. And somebody was in the audience. There was an extraordinary guy in the audience. And this guy says, I want to ask a question, but I want to tell you a little story as part of the question. And he pulls out of his briefcase these pencil drawings that looked to me like the original Superman. And he said one day, about 20 years after Superman was first drawn in the comic books, Joe Shuster was walking down the street of whatever town this guy lived in New Jersey, and he stopped the guy's father, and he said to them, sir, if you don't mind, I'm the guy who drew Superman, and you look exactly like what my image of Superman was. He said, I'd love to just do a quick drawing of you. So he drew in this brilliant pencil drawing what looked like his original Superman, and he'd finally found the guy who looked exactly like him. And this guy had those pencil drawings, and the first time he was ever bringing them out of his house was for that talk at the Boston Public Library. He wanted to know what I thought of them, but more importantly, he wanted to know what I thought he should do with them. And my answer to him was, if you're an incredibly generous guy, and if you're comfortable, you ought to put these in a museum, because these are an extraordinary rendition. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. But if you're not comfortable, and you got kids you want to put through college, those drawings that he brought there that night are easily $1 million and probably a lot more. All you need, as anybody who reads, who follows sort of memorabilia sales knows, that the original 1938, June 1938 comic book in decent shape has sold at auction for more than $1 million. And that's something that there were 200,000 copies of. This is something that's one copy of the ultimate Superman. So what I actually told him was, the first thing before you decide between those two options, go home and call your insurer and get these things insured. More people tell me stories, including two people here today, about having had parents throw away from their basement. What, Batman was, or Superman that yours? What did they throw away?
5,000 comics and 20,000 baseball cards.
Right. Well, so the bad news story is that they threw them away and they would have been worth a fortune. But the other side of that story is if everybody who had had them thrown away had kept them, they'd be worth next to nothing today because there'd be so many copies. Well, that depended who you asked. If you looked at Jerry Siegel's lawsuit, Jerry and Joe sold the rights to Superman to DC Comics in 1938. They were desperate to get it published. They sold the rights for the combined total of $130. Now, that was not the right to the first comic book. It was a right to Superman in perpetuity. Oh, right. So in those depositions, when they sued DC Comics to try to get back the rights, Jerry said they're all knockoffs, that they were all, I created the character and everybody else came along afterwards. If that were true, then you would have to say that what Jerry Siegel wrote and what Joe Shuster drew were knockoffs of everybody from Hercules and Samson to Doc Savage and everybody else. Everybody steals from somebody else, and the question is whether you build enough that's original. And Batman is enough of an original, and Spider-Man even more is enough of an original, that they were knockoffs on the idea that the superhero genre could be enormously successful, but their characters within that genre were distinct enough, and nobody was going to let them sue the owners of Batman because the owners of Batman were DC Comics. If DC could have sued its arch rival Marvel Comics on Spider-Man, they would have, but they knew they had no case. If anybody knows the story of the Midrash, one of the great Jewish sets of holy books, the Midrash talked about the three elements of the world that mattered. And if you look at truth, justice, in the American way and translate the three elements that were in the Midrash, it almost translates directly. And that's not where the truth, justice, and the American way necessarily came from, but everything in it, from playing around with the Hebrew to the general concepts, suggested to me Jerry Siegel never would have said that he was playing games with his readers or that Superman was Jewish. But I think Jerry Siegel understood, he did what every good writer does, which is to write what you know about. And he was writing what he knew about. He grew up in a world that was 95% Jewish, and so by definition, everything that he was coming up with, his vision of what a hero ought to look like, had to be Jewish. And his next hero, who went nowhere, Jerry Siegel's next big attempt at a comic book, was a character called Funny Man, who looked not like this guy in the streets of New Jersey, he looked like Danny Kaye. He looked exactly like Danny Kaye. And he had the one thing that was missing from Superman, if he were a Jew, was a sense of humor, and Funny Man had a sense of humor, and unfortunately Funny Man crashed and died. Well, the thinking, if you're like me and looking at it through the narrow lens of a Jewish thinking, it was that was the story of Genesis. It was also the story, I think, of the explosion of the world as Jerry Siegel saw it that was happening in Eastern Europe, his ancestors' world. And so I think you could say it was either a biblical story or a Holocaust story. What Jerry would say is that he was looking for, this is a kid experimenting with different devices. And if you look at Krypton in the early days, Krypton lasted in that original comic book exactly one panel. It was Superman came down from Krypton, that's all we need to know about Krypton, here's the rest of the story. And then his editors told him later on to go back and let's give us a backstory. If you read, anybody here a Tolkien fan?
Yeah.
Well, so you read there and you get this whole world that Tolkien has created almost from moment one. In Superman, you get a kid's version of it, which is we're going to give you pieces of the world over time. We're going to tell you no mention of whether it was Martha and there were probably 10 names over time that the Kents were called as their first name, but Martha and John weren't even part of the story originally. And then they decided, geez, kids love this enough, let's go back and give them a world. And I love it because Superman is partly a reflection of how America has changed over the last 74 years. In the beginning, the first Superman we were given, who was born during the New Deal, was a New Deal Democrat. He was out there attacking slumlords and wife beaters. And he never told us his politics, but he didn't need to. Every story was about the things that FDR was going after. In the 40s, we're at war, and Superman was a character who took us to war. In the 50s, we were battling the Red Menace, and Superman was out there battling the communists. Every era, he remained true to his central righteousness, but he evolved more than the fruit fly in giving us a character who seemed contemporary, and that was the brilliance. Yes, the hidden meaning is that Superman needed a vulnerability. If he was so powerful that nobody could ever beat him, there'd be no tension in any of his stories. So he had to have a vulnerability. And Krypton was the perfect vulnerability. There are all kinds of, if you buy the Christian or the Jewish, there are all kinds of metaphors to Krypton, but I think he was just to give the character a better storyline. You had something, and then it was so good that we ended up with not just green Krypton, but red and blue, yellow, and gray, and this could do, and it was only the Comic-Con crazies who would know what each kind of Krypton could do. But he gave us enough for the avid fans and for the people who weren't avid but just liked the good story. So the questions were, every major character in Superman had a double L. It was this alliteration thing that they were playing with. And I talked to every Superman writer and publisher who's still alive and looked through everything, and I think people were just having fun. Somebody decided that Lois Lane was this nice alliteration, so we're going to call her sister Lana Lang, and we're going to do it and at one point, one editor was asked that, and they used to have this question thing in the Superman comic books, and he gave some bullshit answer that didn't exactly explain it. So I think somebody was just having fun. But the more interesting question, or the other interesting question, is about Colbert. And a very nice thing happened to my book the other day. Everything is accidental and sort of whimsical, and where you want, the only print medium anymore that seems to carry any clout is the New York Times. So you want to be reviewed in the New York Times, and ideally in the Sunday New York Times. And it was, right, it was the front page. It was a cover review. And I'm convinced it was, I could tell you all kinds of stories about great things that I did in the book to make it a cover review. I'm convinced when they looked at all the books that were going to be reviewed that Sunday, they decided graphically what's more appealing than we can come up with this brilliant-looking Superman, and he looked quite brilliant on the cover, and I'm sure that's why it happened. But after that happened, my editor, publishers see the Sunday New York Times book review a week before they're actually published, because they go out to bookstores, and bookstores want to know what to load up on and all of this. And so what my editor, who's a wonderful marketing guy as well as a brilliant editor, and I concocted was, it's a total crapshoot and it probably won't happen, but we're going to make sure that Monday morning, that the one thing you can be assured that Colbert and Stewart and Jay Leno and everybody out there read is the Sunday New York Times. And we're going to have Monday morning on their desk a funny letter, cover letter from him, the editor, that I wrote, with a copy of the book on their desk, should you ever want to do this. And I also found out that Jon Stewart had just been talking a week before about his passion for Superman. So my dream is someday that one of them does that, and it's a dream that will turn out to be a Jerry Siegel fantasy. But the one fun thing about it is that Superman, if anybody watch Seinfeld, anybody? So I read every episode of Seinfeld, which was like 25 of them, where he mentioned Superman, and you're always looking for famous people who care about your character and can sort of help you do something with it. And I got the fun thing that happened with, if Jon Stewart or Colbert were ever to do this, if you ever watched, did anybody watch the 1950 George Reeves Superman TV series? You did, right. Somebody who offered, I don't think that Colbert or Stewart would find it especially attractive to have me on and author talking about the book, but the guy who's agreed to go with me on anything that I do on TV is a guy named Jack Larson, who was the original Jimmy Olsen on TV. And kids from that era, and a lot of these famous hosts are from that era, they all remember, even more than Superman, the character in the stories that they related to was Jimmy Olsen. And Jack Larson is a huge character. Do you know, by the way, what Jon Stewart, speaking of hidden Jews, do you know what Jon Stewart's born name was? It was Stewart Jonathan Leibowitz. And as part, I don't know whether it was parents or him, but so we put a particular reference to Superman's Jewish background and name changes without saying that we knew he had changed his name. And so far, it's produced absolutely no results. All of my brilliant letters. I'm really glad you asked that question, because no, Clark Kent didn't show up until the later Superman story. But Clark Kent, one of the reasons that I think Superman is different than every other superhero out there, if you're talking about Batman, the real character in Batman is Bruce Wayne, and he was disguised as Batman. If you're talking about Spider-Man, the real character is Peter Parker, who's disguised as Spider-Man. In Superman, the real character is Superman, who is disguised as Clark Kent. And it is this hero looking for his own humanity. He comes to Earth and is trying to relate to we Earthlings, and he takes on this brilliant identity, this everyman identity. And I think that Superman alone would be too powerful and it wouldn't work. We never would have embraced him. But we can all relate to the fact that while we want to be Superman, in reality, on a day-to-day basis, we're a whole lot more like Clark Kent. And I think that dynamic is essential to his heroism and his success. Well, it's a great question, because your wife has a Superman shirt and that she wears because she's a super social worker, and we were kidding earlier about where does she change. She doesn't need a phone booth to change him. Well, so a bad thing happened. Phone booth was not there from the beginning. It came along when the animated Superman cartoons came out by the Fleischer Studio in Florida, and that's where the first ever phone booth came. And then it became iconic in the movies when they had the phone booths. So in the old days, the phone booths were easy. You could actually do something like change your clothes in a phone booth. Today, for a period of time, the phone booths became all glass, and they sort of did away with the potential to surreptitiously change. Today, there are no phone booths. There are no pay phones anymore. And so it has disappeared. There are 100 things like that that seemed like an essential part of the legend of who Superman was, and they've come and gone. And the only essential thing, I think, is who the guy is, what he dresses like, and what he is like inside of him. And those things have never changed, and they can't. You've been a great audience. Thank you for coming.